Story disclaimer. This story is a work of fiction and is intended for entertainment purposes only. The content includes dark themes, horror elements, and fictional depictions of rituals and sacrifices that are purely imaginative and not reflective of any real-life practices or beliefs. Viewer discretion is advised. This video is not suitable for younger audiences, and parental guidance is recommended. The story does not endorse or promote any harmful behavior, violence, or dangerous activities. Please note that all characters, events, and settings are entirely fictional and created for the purpose of storytelling. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events, is purely coincidental. In this final episode, Malik's journey takes a dark and intense turn as he faces an ancient fortress alive with malevolent magic. He navigates halls filled with shifting shadows and encounters soul-stealing entities as he uncovers secrets that bind him to the very heart of darkness. As Malik fights to break free, he taps into forbidden powers, risking everything to confront beings beyond imagination. The line between salvation and ruin blurs, forcing Malik to make unimaginable choices. Will he reclaim control or be consumed by the very forces he seeks to master? Dive in and discover the fate that awaits him in the battle between light and shadow. Just as the shadows closed in, a loud crash echoed from above. Malik looked up in terror as the ceiling began to crack, chunks of stone falling around him. From the darkness above, something huge and unseen stirred, sending tremors through the ground. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it, a presence, dark and terrible, lurking just beyond his sight. The walls around him seemed to pulse with each beat of its heart, as if the very fortress itself was alive and breathing. Malik's skin prickled with fear. Whatever was up there, it was coming for him. Suddenly, the ground split open beneath him, and Malik fell into a deep pit. He hit the bottom hard, gasping as the air was knocked from his lungs. As he struggled to his feet, he realized he wasn't alone. Strange, distorted figures moved in the shadows, their faces twisted in agony, their bodies barely human. They whispered to him, their voices soft but filled with torment. "We were once like you," they said. "Trapped in the darkness, lost to the magic. It will take everything from you." The realization hit Malik like a punch to the gut. These were the souls of those who had come before him, those who had fallen to the same dark magic that was now consuming him. His chest tightened with fear as he backed away, desperate to escape their grasp. But it was too late. The shadows reached out, their hands cold as ice, pulling him down. Malik screamed, struggling against their grip, but they were too strong. His heart raced as the darkness swallowed him whole. Malik awoke in a cold, empty chamber. His body ached, his mind spinning from what had just happened. He could still feel the cold grip of the shadows, the haunting whispers of the trapped souls ringing in his ears. But now, he was not alone. There was a single figure standing in the corner. It was a woman, her face hidden beneath a veil, her presence both alluring and terrifying. She stepped forward, her voice echoing in the chamber. "Do you know where you are, Malik?" she asked, her tone calm but filled with an unsettling power. Malik shook his head, fear gripping him once more. "You're in the heart of the fortress," she said, her eyes glowing faintly beneath the veil. "This is where all those who have fallen to the magic come. This is where their souls are collected, bound to the darkness forever." The woman raised her hand, and suddenly the room was filled with the same glowing symbols Malik had seen on the walls earlier. But this time, the symbols were moving, swirling around him like a vortex. Malik's heart raced as he felt a pull deep within him, as if the magic was trying to tear him apart from the inside. "You've tasted the power, haven't you?" the woman said, her voice growing colder. "And now it wants more. It will take everything from you, just like it did with the others." "No!" Malik cried out, panic rising in his chest. "I won't let it." The woman's laughter echoed in the chamber, cruel and mocking. You think you have a choice, she said. The magic has already claimed you. There is no escape. As her words sank in, Malik felt the pull grow stronger, the symbols tightening around him like chains. His heart pounded in his chest as the dark magic began to suffocate him, draining the very essence of his soul. Malik's vision blurred as the magic constricted around him, but he fought with everything he had left. He couldn't give in, not yet. There had to be a way out, a way to break free from the darkness. In his desperation, Malik remembered something the figure had told him before, the portrait. The portrait was the key to everything. If he could destroy it, he could break the curse and free himself from the magic once and for all. With newfound determination, Malik pushed against the chains of magic that held him. It was agonizing, every movement felt like his body was being torn apart, but he refused to give up. He had come too far to fail now. The woman watched him struggle, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. "You can't fight the magic," she hissed. "It's already inside you. It will consume you." But Malik didn't listen. With a final, desperate surge of strength, he broke free from the magic's grip and ran toward the door at the far end of the chamber. The woman screamed, her voice filled with rage, but Malik didn't look back. He had to find the portrait. It was his only chance. As he burst through the door, Malik found himself in a long, dark hallway. The walls were lined with portraits, each one twisted and grotesque, depicting the souls of those who had fallen to the magic. But there, at the very end of the hall, was his own portrait, his own face, distorted and decayed, reflecting the toll the magic had taken on him. With trembling hands, Malik reached for the portrait. The moment his fingers touched the canvas, the fortress around him shook violently, as if the very foundation of the dark magic was crumbling. But as he stared into the eyes of his own portrait, Malik realized the horrifying truth: the magic wasn't just bound to the portrait, it was bound to him. Destroying the portrait would destroy him, too. His heart pounded as he stood frozen in front of the painting, torn between his desire for freedom and the terrifying realization that he might not survive the price. Malik's fingers trembled on the decaying canvas of his portrait. His reflection, twisted and monstrous, stared back at him, mocking his efforts to escape. The dark energy pulsated from the frame, vibrating with the intense magic that bound his very soul to it. Destroying this portrait was his last chance, but it also meant his destruction. The fortress groaned as though alive, reacting to his thoughts. The walls around him started to ripple, shaking violently as if they were mirrors on the edge of shattering. The dark magic that sustained the fortress was tethered to this moment. With a desperate cry, Malik grasped the portrait and hurled it to the ground. The glass shattered, and an ear-piercing scream filled the air, not just from the portrait but from deep within the bowels of the fortress itself. The very stones seemed to scream in agony, as if Malik had torn out the heart of the ancient dark magic. But instead of breaking free, Malik was hit with an intense wave of pain, a burning sensation ripping through his chest. He fell to his knees, gasping as the dark energy surged into him, trying to pull him into the void. His vision blurred, his limbs went numb, and his mind screamed with the sensation of 1,000 invisible hands clawing at his soul. "You're too late," a voice hissed from the shadows. The woman from earlier stepped into the light, her veil now gone. Her face, once human, had transformed into something nightmarish. Her eyes were hollow voids, her skin cracked like a dried riverbed, glowing with dark energy. "You think breaking the portrait would save you," she said with a sneer. "The magic isn't just in the portrait. It's in you. It has always been in you. Now you belong to it forever." Malik's chest tightened as the woman's words sank in. His own body began to contort, each nerve inside him twisting with dark power. The fortress seemed to pulse in time with his heart, as if feeding off his life force. Every breath he took seemed to invite the darkness further in. The woman raised her hand, and Malik felt himself lifted off the ground by an unseen force, his limbs flailing helplessly. The darkness within him responded to her command, like a puppet obeying its master. "Look around you," the woman said, her voice dripping with cruelty. Malik could barely focus, but when he did, his blood ran cold. Around him, the portraits of other souls began to move, their figures writhing in pain. Their eyes followed him, filled with sorrow and torment, as if they had all tried to escape the same fate and failed. "I was like you once," the woman continued, her hollow eyes glimmering. "I too thought I could outsmart the magic. I was foolish. But now I serve it, and so will you." With a flick of her hand, Malik was slammed to the ground, pain exploding in his head. The room was spinning, and the air was thick with the scent of something ancient and decayed. He could feel the fortress closing in on him, trapping him in a web of magic he couldn't escape. "You see, Malik, the magic has chosen you. It flows through your veins now, and there is no going back. Your soul is no longer yours." She laughed, a low, menacing sound that echoed through the halls. Malik's heart raced as he struggled to push himself up, his body weak, drained. He was fighting not just for his freedom but for his very soul. He could feel the darkness creeping deeper, trying to devour him from the inside. But deep down, a small ember of hope still flickered. He wasn't done yet. With his last ounce of strength, Malik managed to stand. His body ached with every movement, and the dark energy inside him threatened to consume him whole. The woman smiled coldly, watching him like a predator playing with its prey. "I won't let you win," Malik whispered, though his voice was weak. "Oh, you're mistaken," she said, her eyes narrowing. "You've already lost." But Malik wasn't ready to give in. He had come too far, sacrificed too much. He knew the only way to defeat the magic was to understand it, to turn it against itself. Malik remembered the words he had once heard about the fortress, about the ancient power that had built it. If the magic could bind, then it could also be severed. Summoning the last remnants of his willpower, Malik began to speak in a language he didn't even know he understood, a forgotten tongue that seemed to spill from his mouth unbidden. The words were sharp, harsh, cutting through the air like a blade. The woman's eyes widened, her smile faltering. What are you doing?" Malik ignored her, focusing on the ancient words. The room shook violently, and the portraits on the walls began to shift again, but this time something different was happening. The faces in the paintings were no longer writhing in torment, they were changing. The shadows in the room recoiled as Malik continued the incantation, his voice growing stronger. The dark energy that had been binding him loosened, and for the first time since entering the fortress, he felt a flicker of control. "No," the woman screamed, stepping toward him. "You can't." But it was too late. Malik's eyes glowed with a fierce light as he completed the incantation. The fortress trembled, the walls cracking as the very foundations of the dark magic began to crumble. The woman screamed in agony, her body dissolving into the shadows as the magic that had sustained her for so long was ripped away. As the room collapsed around him, Malik realized that the darkness was no longer trying to consume him. He had turned it against itself. But as the fortress crumbled, so did his strength. The darkness may have been broken, but at what cost? The fortress continued to tremble violently as Malik stood amidst the chaos. The air around him rippled with a strange energy, pulsating from the fractured walls and the shattered remains of the portraits. He had tapped into something ancient, something deeper than even the magic that had once controlled him. But now, that power was becoming unhinged. Dark clouds began swirling inside the room, conjured by the collapse of the ancient spells that had held the fortress together. These were no ordinary clouds, they were thick, black tendrils of shadow, infused with centuries of dark magic. They snaked through the air, crackling with energy, drawn toward Malik as if seeking to claim him. Malik's heart pounded as the tendrils inched closer, each one humming with ominous power. His hands instinctively raised in defense, and he could feel the remnants of the magic he had unleashed still coursing through him. But this magic was different. It was wild, untamed, and far more dangerous than anything he had encountered before. With a flick of his wrist, Malik tried to push the shadows back, using the ancient incantations he had barely learned. But the tendrils seemed to absorb his attempts, growing larger and more aggressive. They wrapped around his arms and legs, pulling him to the ground, sinking into his skin as if they were feeding on his very essence. A cold wave of terror washed over him as the realization hit: the fortress itself was a living entity, and it wasn't about to let him go. The walls cracked further, and from the broken stones emerged figures, dark, twisted forms that had been trapped for centuries. These were the remnants of those who had made pacts with the same ancient magic, their souls bound to the fortress just as Malik's had been. Their eyes, hollow and glowing faintly, stared at him with a mixture of rage and envy. They had been waiting for this moment. "Join us," one of the figures hissed, its voice like a gust of cold wind. "You will never be free." Malik struggled to stand, his body weakened by the assault of the dark magic. He could feel the fortress tightening its grip on him, its energy coiling around his soul. The dark figures closed in, their forms shifting and swirling with the shadows. There was no escape. But Malik wasn't finished yet. Desperation fueled Malik as he scrambled to remember the incantations he had learned. The magic inside him was dangerous, but it was his only weapon. As the dark figures surrounded him, their eyes glowing with the hunger of 1,000 lost souls, Malik's mind raced to find a way out. He had no choice but to turn to the darkest of spells, the ancient ritual that no mortal dared to attempt. The shadows twisted around him, whispering in a language that was older than time itself, the language of darkness and death. Malik's skin crawled as the voices spoke directly into his mind, urging him to give in, to accept his fate as one of them. But he refused to surrender. Closing his eyes, he began chanting once more, this time invoking a ritual that had been passed down through the forbidden scrolls of ancient sorcery. His voice trembled at first, but soon it grew louder, filled with the power of the ancient words. The air around him crackled as the magic surged. The dark figures halted their advance, momentarily stunned by the energy Malik was unleashing. The shadows recoiled, pulling back as the magic pulsed through the room. The ground beneath Malik's feet shook violently when cracks began to form, spreading like a spiderweb across the floor. With each word of the incantation, Malik felt the dark magic inside him growing stronger, but it also came with a price. His body felt as though it were being torn apart from within, the power too much for any mortal to bear. But he couldn't stop, not now. This was his only chance. The figures screamed in agony as the ritual reached its peak, their forms disintegrating into the swirling shadows. The ground beneath Malik split open, revealing a glowing, pulsating core of raw, untamed magic, the very heart of the fortress itself. Malik could feel its pull, the force that was both terrifying and intoxicating. If he could harness it, he would have the power to break free. But the cost would be unimaginable. With a final, desperate shout, Malik reached toward the core. The moment Malik's hand touched the core, a shockwave of energy erupted, throwing him backward with such force that he crashed into the crumbling wall behind him. Pain exploded through his body, but the power that surged into him was unlike anything he had ever felt. His veins burned with raw magic, and the shadows that had once threatened to consume him now bent to his will. The dark figures screamed as they disintegrated into nothingness, their forms erased by the sheer force of the magic Malik had unleashed. The fortress trembled violently, its ancient foundations crumbling under the weight of the unleashed power. But as the magic flowed through him, Malik realized something horrifying: he was no longer in control. The power was too great, too vast for any mortal to command. It was tearing him apart from the inside, devouring his soul even as it granted him unimaginable strength. His skin began to crack, glowing with the same dark energy that had sustained the fortress for centuries. The magic was consuming him, transforming him into something else, something not entirely human. A voice echoed in his mind, deep and resonant, filled with both wisdom and malice. You have chosen the path of power, Malik. But power comes with a price. Malik's breath came in ragged gusts as he struggled to hold on to his humanity. The fortress was collapsing around him, the very walls crumbling into dust, but the magic wouldn't let him go. It had claimed him, body and soul. No, he shouted, his voice hoarse. He fought against the pull of the dark energy, but it was like trying to hold back a tidal wave. The ground beneath him opened up, revealing a chasm of swirling darkness. The shadows reached for him, hungry and relentless. Malik's heart pounded in his chest as he realized what was happening. He had become the new vessel for the ancient magic, the new master of the darkness. But it wasn't a position of power. It was a prison. With one final, desperate scream, Malik was pulled into the abyss. Malik's scream echoed as he plummeted into the dark abyss, the shadows wrapping around him like the cold grip of death. The descent felt endless, as though he were falling through time itself, deeper into the heart of the ancient magic that now possessed him. The air grew thick with a foul, bitter taste, like burning incense mixed with decay. A sense of overwhelming dread filled Malik's mind. This was no longer just a fortress, it was a living nightmare, a void of pure malevolence. Suddenly, the fall stopped. Malik found himself standing on solid ground, though it felt wrong beneath his feet, as if the very earth were alive and shifting. Before him loomed a massive altar, carved from obsidian and pulsing with the same dark energy that had consumed the fortress. Around it stood hooded figures, their forms barely visible in the swirling darkness. These figures were not like the spirits he had faced earlier. They radiated a different kind of power, ancient, oppressive, and far more dangerous. They had no faces, only shadows where their features should have been. But their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, piercing through the darkness and locking onto Malik. Welcome, the voice rumbled, deep and resonant, seeming to come from everywhere at once. You have crossed the threshold. The price of power has been paid. Malik's heart raced. His body trembled as the dark energy surged through him, but he fought to maintain control. What is this place? Who are you? We are the keepers, the voice replied. Guardians of the ancient magic you have tapped into. And now, you are one of us. Malik's stomach dropped. He had been tricked. This was no mere magical transaction, this was a binding pact with something far older and far more powerful than he could have imagined. He took a step back, but the ground beneath him rippled like water, preventing his retreat. The hooded figures moved closer, their eyes fixed on him, glowing brighter as they spoke in unison, their voices cold and devoid of emotion. You sought power beyond your comprehension, Malik. Now, you shall wield it, but only as a servant of the abyss. Malik's mind raced. He couldn't let this happen. The magic coursing through his veins still held some remnants of his control, and he refused to become a slave to the abyss. He looked at the altar, the source of this dark energy, and a thought sparked in his mind. If he could destroy it, perhaps he could break free from their control. Summoning every ounce of strength left in him, Malik extended his hands toward the altar. The dark energy flared around him, swirling with violent intent. He focused on the glowing core of the altar, muttering the ancient incantations he had learned. The hooded figures recoiled, their voices rising in a chant of resistance, trying to stop him. The altar began to crack, its surface splintering like glass. The energy around it became erratic, and the ground beneath Malik trembled violently. No, the voices screamed in unison. You cannot. But it was too late. A massive explosion of energy erupted from the altar, sending shockwaves through the abyss. Malik was thrown backward, his body crashing into the ground with a force that knocked the air from his lungs. The hooded figures disintegrated, their forms unraveling into wisps of shadow, consumed by the very magic they had sought to control. The ground beneath the altar shattered, and from the depths of the crack, the blinding light burst forth. It wasn't the cold, dark energy of the fortress, but something purer, something older than even the ancient magic Malik had encountered. The abyss screamed in protest as the light grew brighter, overwhelming the darkness that had ruled this place for centuries. Malik staggered to his feet, his body aching from the force of the blast. He could feel the magic within him weakening, slipping from his grasp. The power he had sought was fading, its control over him breaking as the altar collapsed into ruin. But something else was emerging from the light. A figure rose from the shattered ground, cloaked in shimmering robes that seemed to be made of pure light. Its face was obscured, but its presence was undeniable, a being of immense power, far beyond anything Malik had ever encountered. "You have broken the cycle," the figure spoke, its voice soft yet commanding. "The darkness no longer holds you, but the price for what you have done is yet to be paid." Malik's chest tightened as he realized the enormity of his actions. He had not only destroyed the ancient magic that had bound him, but he had also unleashed something far more powerful, a force that neither the Keepers nor the Abyss could control. What are you?" Malik asked, his voice trembling. "I am the balance," the figure replied. "For every shadow, there must be light. You have upset the equilibrium, and now the world will face the consequences." The light around the figure dimmed, and the ground beneath Malik's feet began to crack once more. This time, it wasn't the abyss pulling him down, but the weight of the balance itself. The world around him shifted, bending and warping as reality itself began to fracture. Malik's heart pounded in his chest. He had wanted power, but now he realized he had set something far worse into motion. The balance was coming for him, and there was no escape. Malik stood frozen as the world twisted around him, the lines between light and darkness blurring. The shimmering figure of the balance loomed before him, its eyes glowing with an intensity that pierced through Malik's soul. "The ancient magic you sought was never meant to be touched by mortal hands," the balance said. "You have disrupted the natural order, and now the cost must be paid." A cold sweat dripped down Malik's forehead. His legs felt like they were made of lead, rooted to the ground as the air around him buzzed with a strange, otherworldly energy. The cracks in the ground continued to spread, and from them, ghostly shapes began to rise, souls trapped between the realms of light and darkness. Their eyes were hollow, their faces twisted in silent agony, caught in the struggle between the forces Malik had unleashed. Malik's mind raced. He had always been driven by his thirst for power, but now he saw the truth: there was no victory in this. The balance had no mercy. It was not good, nor was it evil. It simply was. "You must decide," the balance spoke again, its voice calm but commanding. "Will you sacrifice yourself to restore the balance, or will you condemn the world to darkness?" The question hit Malik like a physical blow. Sacrifice himself. The very idea filled him with dread. But as he looked around, at the broken spirits caught in the storm of magic, he knew there was no other choice. He had caused this. He had to fix it. With a heavy heart, Malik knelt before the figure of the balance. His body trembled, and the dark magic within him surged one final time, resisting his decision. But he pushed it aside. He was done fighting. "I choose to restore the balance," he whispered. The figure of the balance extended a hand, and as Malik took it, a wave of warmth washed over him. The darkness inside him began to fade, dissolving into nothingness as the light consumed him. He felt no pain, only a deep sense of peace as his body and soul were pulled into the light, merging with the very force he had once sought to control. The world around him shifted once more, but this time, it was not collapsing. The cracks in the ground sealed, and the swirling shadows dissipated, replaced by a calm, serene light. Malik had made his choice. When Malik opened his eyes, he was no longer in the abyss. He stood in a vast, open field, bathed in the soft light of dawn. The fortress, the shadows, the keepers, they were all gone. The air was clean, the sky clear. It was as though the darkness had never existed. Malik's body felt weightless, free from the burden of the dark magic that had once consumed him. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt whole. A gentle breeze blew through the field, carrying with it the scent of fresh grass and earth. Malik looked down at his hands, expecting to see the dark veins of magic that had once marked him, but they were gone. His skin was clear, untouched by the corruption of the abyss. The balance had been restored. But as Malik stood there, he knew that his journey wasn't over. The balance was not a force that could be destroyed, only maintained. There would always be those who sought power, who would tamper with forces they couldn't control. And there would always be a need for those who could restore what had been broken. Malik had been given a second chance, but he knew the darkness would always be lurking, waiting for the next soul to claim. With a deep breath, Malik began walking toward the horizon, the dawn of a new day stretching before him. He had survived the abyss, but the world would never be the same. And neither would he.